would have seen positive effects of cover cropping there, where compared to just allowing the field as is after the spring barley was harvested. So we would have seen reductions in nitrate leaching of about 20 kilos of nitrate nitrogen from the a leafy turnip forage rape mix, so your general gloss mix.
The National Tillage Conference was held on Wednesday, January the 29th, and it featured excellent presentations, which we'll hear two of again today. You are listening to the latest episode of the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. We'd really appreciate it if you could listen, follow, and give us a review on Apple or Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast from. Two of the biggest challenges facing tillage farmers in the coming years are reducing nitrate leaching from tillage soils and exploring the potential of carbon capture and even the possibility of monetising this asset. I'm delighted to be joined by Giulia Bondi and Bridget Lynch, both researchers in Johnstown Castle in Teagasc, to discuss the information they presented at the National Tillage Conference. I began by asking Bridget to explain the Agricultural Catchments Programme and what it aims to achieve.
The Agricultural Catchments Programme is an integrated research and advisory programme. It was established in 2008 and has been funded by the Department of Agriculture since then. I suppose it was tasked by the Department of Agriculture to evaluate the current gap measures, so the current NAP and the influence of derogation farming. So they were the primary objectives of the programme and have been all along and continue to be. I suppose in the most recent phase of the programme, we have had a focus on mitigation measures and evaluation mitigation measures at a localised or sub-catchment scale. So
it's trying to track what farmers, the outcome, I suppose, of what farmers are actually, changing on the ground, and see how that kind of results in either N or P or sediment maybe as well, or in terms of what effects it's having on rivers.
Yeah, exactly. So it's evaluating what farmers have to do, so what's in regulation. And so exactly like on nitrogen, phosphorus, we pick up sediment, aquatic ecology, soil fertility changes, and so on. Positively or negatively, and I suppose we learn about the processes and the drivers of those losses, and we've a big, I suppose, data set gathered now at this stage.
So a catchment, just so people are clear, a catchment that you're recording is the water that would flow into, if you like, say like a valley, anything that kind of goes into that valley, and you're measuring the water coming out of the far side. Will that explain it?
Yeah, exactly. So the catchment boundary would be where it rains within that catchment boundary. We are catching all of that river or all of that rainwater flowing out of the outlet. And we've monitoring at different scales within the catchment.
Both on surface and deep down in the ground as well, and we'll come to that in a minute. There's lots of catchments around the country, from Cork to the west and the northeast, but in particular we're going to maybe focus on the one in the southeast.
Yeah, so we have 6 catchments in total. I suppose they were chosen to be representative of the dominant agricultural land use. So we've grassland dominant catchments, we've tillage dominant catchment, and then we've a mixture of both. They are, I suppose, across variant soil types as well. So free draining, heavier soil types, with the idea that we would have I suppose nitrogen risky catchments and phosphorus risky catchments. Our main tillage catchment is Castle Dockrell in Wexford, so it's about 1,100 hectares, of which about 55% is used for tillage each year. It's a free draining catchment, and I suppose the main crops there are spring barley, and then there would be some winter barley and a third crop in there as well, varying from farm to farm. But that's our main tillage catchment. We have other catchments that also have some tillage. So Ballycanoe in North Wexford has about 20% tillage. That would be largely spring barley as well, but that's a poorly drained catchment, so it's more a phosphorus risky compared to Castle Dockrell as a nitrate risky catchment. And then Dunleer in the northeast would also have a significant amount of tillage as well, but more, I suppose that's winter wheat country, together with some barley and potatoes and things like that. It's probably a little bit more diverse compared to Castle Dockrell with regards to its crops.
And at the National Tillage Conference, you presented some data around the role of cover crops and the role that that has in terms of reducing nitrogen leaching through that freely draining soil. You might explain, how much of that was there and kind of what the results was really showing us.
Yeah, so we've, I suppose, been trying to focus on cover cropping and getting data from the catchment. Particular focus, I suppose, since the new measure came in 2022 through the NAP, the fifth NAP. And we've done studies and we've been focusing on the monitoring at different scales. So we have done a lysimeter study, which looks at drainage water to about 1 meter of depth in the catchment, and we would have seen positive effects of cover cropping there, where compared to just allowing the field as is after the spring barley was harvested. So we would have seen reductions in nitrate leaching of about 20 kilos of nitrate and nitrogen from the a leafy turnip forage rape mix, so your general gloss mix compared to the control.
So when you say 20 kilos, is that 10% reduction, 20% reduction, or can you say on a percentage kind of basis to give people an idea? Because 20 kilos probably doesn't mean a lot to people when they don't know what the scale we're talking about.
Yeah, so the leafy turnip or forage rape treatment would have been about 10 kilos of nitrogen lost, and then the control would have been just over 30 kilos of nitrate nitrogen lost, if you're comparing one versus the other.
A very significant reduction then.
Yeah, yeah. So, and then also in the catchment, we have groundwater well monitoring. So that looks at the groundwater at varying depths within the catchment and in the profile. So we have those at position north and south. We have a transect, so 3 groundwater wells in the north of the catchment and 3 groundwater wells at the south of the catchment. And we have seen, I suppose, where we've had a sort of land use change in the north of the catchment, where we've had a field that's been in continuous spring barley, but with cover cropping over successive winters, together with a grassland ley that is used for cutting only. And we've seen a significant reduction in nitrate in that well compared to the southern well that has had fallow cropland over the winter with some cover crops in some years and not in other years. So we're just seeing that positive effect of, I suppose, winter green cover in the north of the catchment compared to the south of the catchment in the groundwater monitoring. And so that's seen the effect both in drainage through the lysimeter study, but also in the groundwater. We're picking up an effect of it.
So the green cover, or the cover crops, which is probably distinct to a green cover being just whatever grows after harvest kind of thing. I presume that's the distinction there. So what you're saying, if I'm picking you up right, is that cover crops are working really well in terms of mopping up the potential nitrate in the year, but if you have successive cover crops, it has an additional effect in terms of the overall long-term nitrates that are kind of flowing out of the catchment.
Yeah, at the groundwater level monitoring. And I suppose this year we've seen a very positive increase in the amount of cover crops that are sown in the catchment this year with the onset of the EIP water funding, or the Farming for Water EIP funding. So when we looked at the area that would have been sown through acres or through gloss from 22 to 24, it was relatively steady. It probably averaged across that period of about 150 hectares. But with the addition of the EIP this year, within the catchment boundary, we've seen an increase of 87% in the cover crop sown compared to 2023. So we've had a big increase in cover crops grown this year. So we will need, I suppose, successive years of that type of buy-in in order to see that positive effect at the drainage and the groundwater level having an impact in the deeper aquifers. So when we look at the surface water monitoring at the outlet in Castledockrell, we've quite a constant supply of nitrogen that's coming through there throughout the year. Actually, in our grassland catchments, it can we can have quite significant peaks and troughs, but in Castledockrell it's quite steady, the supply of nitrogen at the surface water monitoring. So we've this large reserve of nitrogen in the deep aquifer that's supplying that. So we need to, I suppose, have these higher levels of cover crops sown in successive years in order to deplete that reserve over a period of time. And we're definitely on the way to that with what we've seen in the level of buy-in that we've had in the Farming for Water EIP funding available this year. And that's available for the next 3 years as well, up to the end of 2027. So, we could have 4 really good years of cover crop growth.
Good results. Well, listen, it's fantastic to hear, and thanks very much for joining us. But it's fantastic to hear that all of the things, I suppose, from a Teagasc point of view, in terms of promoting cover crops, in terms of the main thing we said that we're going to do, kind of based on research, that it's actually happening in a kind of a larger scale. So, look, I think that's brilliant, and continue the good work, and hopefully over the next 2 or 3 years, if farmers continue to do that, we'll see even better results coming through, and maybe a bit more in terms of feeding that back in through policy. Bridget, thanks very much, and congratulations on the Tillage Conference talk.
Thanks, Michael.
Now I'd like to turn to Giulia Bondi, a researcher in Johnstown Castle. Giulia's work focuses on carbon storage in soils. She begins by explaining what carbon sequestration is, as well as the difference between soils functioning as a carbon sink or a carbon source.
So I'd say different system can act as a sink or a source of carbon. If the CO2 uptake is less than what is released, the soil acts as a source of carbon. Vice versa, if the CO2 uptake in a soil is higher than the CO2 that is released, the soil acts as a carbon sink. The important bit is that the carbon that is sequestered is the amount of carbon that is left in the soil after this exchange. So to measure carbon sequestration in a soil, we need to have at least 2 measures of carbon over time, and that's how you measure carbon sequestration. It is largely affected by farming system and management. So if we can control the management, we will potentially be able to increase the sequestration over time.
I think there might be a bit of a confusion maybe with some farmers, or when they're thinking about carbon. So a plant essentially holds carbon in it, and let's say a plant is incorporated into the soil. Would it be correct in saying not all of that carbon is going to be trapped in that soil in the longer term? A lot of it's released back.
Yeah, that's correct. So the plant uptakes CO2 from the atmosphere and uses to grow its own biomass. But then there is a lot of different forms of carbon that gets back into the soil through root exudates, for example, to plant residues, etc. And all of them have a turnover in the soil, and they are subjected to decomposition by microorganisms. And all this process is what drives, let's say, the sequestration.
As you mentioned in the Tillage Conference, there's other factors as well in terms of the influence of soil type or soil depth in terms of storing that carbon. You might maybe touch upon some of those factors.
Yeah, that's correct. So different soil types certainly have a different capacity to store carbon. For example, lighter soil have a high carbon uptakes, but also the carbon that is leaving the system is quite high. So they sequester less carbon overall. On the other hand, for example, heavier soil have a similar uptake, but the carbon that has the tendency to bind with the clay particles. So it stays in the soil for longer periods of time, and there it becomes more stable. So for these particular soils, the carbon sequestration potential is higher. And you mentioned also the soil depth, that is also very important, I'd say. No, so we have evidence that about 20 to 30% of the overall carbon of the soil profile is actually stored below 30 centimeters in the profile, so in depth. So this amount of carbon certainly can vary based on the soil type or the management that is applied, but this is still a considerable amount of carbon that has not been accounted for in the past. So what we are trying to to do is to address this issue with a deep soil sampling campaign, such as the one that we are carrying out in the Signpost program.
And if there's one thing I've heard along the way in terms of the work that's involved in doing these deep soil samples, it's pretty enormous. It's a massive undertaking. But at the Tillage Conference, you presented some data from the 10 tillage signpost farms that we have out there, and you managed to get around to all those farms, and you managed to take those measurements from down deep as well. How did those farms compare in how you thought they might have compared, or maybe even comparing to grassland type enterprises?
Yes, that's correct. We only have preliminary data. This is are the ones that I presented in the conference, and they are related to 10 farms only. So there is a lot of work going on the Signpost program and in other programs across the country. So the data that I show, in the data that I show, the overall carbon stocks for the tillage farms range between 48 and 140 tons of carbon per hectare. And this brings us to an average of about 90 tons of carbon per hectare, while for the grassland farms, they reach up to about an average of 110 tons of carbon per hectare. So you can see they are pretty comparable overall, the two systems. The interesting part, however, is the distribution of the carbon in the profile. For the grassland systems, what we have seen is that they have higher carbon in the topsoil, while the tillage systems or the tillage farms have more carbon distributed in depth, up to 60 centimeters, so even in the deeper layers. This is due partially to the management that has been historically performed to these soils, for example, the plowing activity, where the carbon is applied in the topsoil and is buried down the profile and is stabilized there. So this brings to higher carbon down below 30 centimeters.
Okay, it's not a result I think we necessarily would have been expecting. I think we probably would have been expecting very much lower carbon stock in tillage farms in comparison to grassland. Along with the factors you talked about there in terms of the distribution, so essentially we're plowing down some of that carbon and trapping it down a little bit lower. Are there other things that can maybe explain it a little bit? Or is there a soil factor or soil type factor involved in there as well?
Oh, yeah, the soil type certainly makes the difference, in particular the clay content, I'd say, because the clay content sets the potential size of the sink. In heavier soil, the carbon is protected, as I said, by smaller soil particle, again, silt and clay. And if we don't apply any major disturbance to the soil, the carbon becomes stable, so less carbon will be lost to the atmosphere. In general, as you say, annual cropping is likely to result in somewhat less carbon with less contribution from the permanent root mat that we typically have in grassland systems, and also by the fact that more aggregate are exposed in plowing system to respiration through tillage, but the results in general are quite comparable. An important thing is that up to now we have only looking at the topsoil data, while now we are trying to look at depths, and that's where the two systems are kind of closer together, right? So the soil type is not just is not the only factor. The climate is also an important factor. In humid environments like the one that we have here in Ireland, often these environments leads to the soil to be saturated with water, and they slow down the microbial activities that decompose organic matter, resulting in less losses of carbon. In Mediterranean countries, for example, the dry climate and the high temperature increase or push the decomposition of organic matter, leading to greater losses of carbon from the soil. So the climate is really key as well as the soil type.
Okay, so even though tillage farmers mightn't like to hear it, the fact that we're wetter is kind of insulating us from losing a lot of that carbon.
Somehow, yes.
A final question, and look, this is already good news, I suppose, really from a tillage point of view. But from, I suppose, what lots of people are looking for, especially in industry, are looking for is as a zero carbon system, or even the addition of carbon into those soils. What do you think is the best way of trying to increase the carbon in soils, in tillage soils?
So the addition of carbon sources is certainly very important. The chops, straw, cover crops, or high carbon manures, for example, farmyard manures, can help to maintain or improve the soil carbon levels. But these additions are very small and need to be practiced continually to have any impact. So it's a very slow build up. It takes a long time to build up carbon, and this is absolutely important. This is a message that we want to bring to the audience, I suppose. The activity of burying carbon in the deeper soil layers for soils that are rich in clay is certainly, in principle, a strategy that helps to improve carbon at depth. But also, it's important to understand that this needs to be balanced with the risk of causing structural damage through deepening cultivation, for example. So it is important to have a balance on how we cultivate the soil or how we manage the soil, and how we keep the structure right, the structure quality high.
And as you say, they're all interconnected. But when you say it takes a long time to build up carbon in soils, are we talking about 5 years, 6 years, 10 years maybe?
No, we are talking about decades. So to double your carbon, you might need from, we have evidence, for example, that in some environments, to double your carbon from 40 tons per hectare to 80 tons per hectare, you might need over 100 years. So, like it really, really is a slow build up. So it's important to understand where we have this carbon, to which soil types this carbon is associated. When we have quite a lot or high contents, let's say, and maintain this carbon as much as we can, as well as improve it, with the time.
Okay. Listen, Giulia, that's great. And a thought kind of strikes me as you're talking there is that we're only minding the soils for the next generation. So that's really where this comes into it in terms of carbon stocks. Listen, I really enjoyed your paper at the Tillage Conference, and so thanks very much for that. I will have you back on the Tillage Edge again soon.
Thanks to you, Michael. Thanks.
So that's it for this episode, and my thanks to Giulia and Bridget for joining me on the podcast. We're nearing the end of our national series of tillage seminars, with the final event scheduled for next week in Tullamore and in Burt, Donegal. These sessions will cover a variety of topics focused on local challenges. For more details, visit teagasc.ie/events. So finally, if you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague, and as always, rate, review and follow on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy, thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.